Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with the acclaimed science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson. I have been a big fan of Kim Stanley Robinson for a long time, and unbeknownst to me, our team scheduled an interview with Stan on my birthday without telling me. And it was a delightful, of course, they let me know ahead of time, but it was a delightful treat that they gave me. And of course, I found myself, I usually these days, I've gotten to interview so many delightful, wonderful people. I don't get very nervous or anxious before an interview, but I found myself just a little bit of extra energy, a little bit of excitement, a little bit of anxiety interviewing the great Kim Stanley Robinson, all that, don't meet your heroes kind of stuff. And it was just a wonderful conversation, and it was really lovely and really beautiful. If you don't know him, then you're going to be fascinated with him after this interview. And I would say go out and read one of his books, especially he was best known for his Mars trilogy. I've read 2 of the 3 so far. And then I've read a bunch of his other books. But the one that we especially talked about in this interview is his book, Ministry for the Future, that came out in 2020. That's about the climate crisis. It's a compelling, super helpful, really educational, very entertaining book. Here's our interview with Kim Stanley Robinson, who now I get to call Stan. Enjoy. Hey friend, if you didn't know, I started a newsletter a while back that comes out every 2 weeks. I have been delighted to hear from so many of you about positive response to the newsletter. We call it the No Small Endeavor Notebook, where I riff on themes and topics related to our podcast, giving you additional material for thinking and doing in your own quest to make sense of what it might mean to live a good life. Join us by going now to nosmallendeavor.com and sign up there. Again, go to nosmallendeavor.com to sign up now for our free No Small Endeavor Notebook newsletter. Kim Stanley Robinson is one of the most influential science fiction writers of the past half-century. He is a New York Times bestselling author. He's also the winner of the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards. He's written more than 20 novels, including the landmark Mars trilogy, and later works such as 2312, New York 2140, and The Ministry for the Future. Beyond that, he's something of an adventurer, has twice traveled to Antarctica with the U.S. National Science Foundation, and was named a Hero of the Environment by Time magazine. Stan, welcome to No Small Endeavor.
Thanks, Lee. It's good to be with you.
Yes, I'm delighted to get to be with you. I was telling you before we started that I've read more fiction from you than any fiction writer I've ever read, and so especially grateful to get to spend some time with you today. I would love to kind of maybe start with a bit of your biography and the way your own life story has gotten you into doing what you've done with your work. And I'm wondering, I understand that you were a voracious reader as a child.
Yes.
When you think back about those days of reading, what was going on with you? What was the kind of, what captured you or hooked you into that voracious habit?
Let me think about that out loud. I grew up in Orange County, California, which at that time, the 1950s and 1960s, was orange groves and also lemon and avocado and strawberry fields. It was agricultural, but in a sense of orchards. And then Los Angeles was rapidly expanding. And I saw those orange groves torn out at a rate of 5 acres a day, every day for 10 years, until it was part of the city. And it had been completely covered by freeways and suburban homes and apartment blocks and shopping malls, etc. So when I was a kid, that didn't register as unusual. That was just the way life was. It didn't shock me or dismay me until later, when I thought it over and realized that I had grown up in the misapprehension that I was like Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, which were the first 2 books that knocked me for a loop and put me into a different world. But it seemed familiar to me. It was as if they were contemporaries of mine, wandering the orange groves as I was. And of course, that feeling quickly went away, and I realized that I was in the modern times. And so eventually that led to me discovering science fiction and reading science fiction and feeling like science fiction captured the way that I felt better than ordinary literature. But to get back to your question, well, aside from the orange groves, which were going away, suburbia, middle class, safe, calm, actually almost a utopian childhood where I had music through my mom and sports through my dad, and a rather beautiful childhood. But it was boring. There wasn't any color or surprises or strangenesses. It was monotone and regularized, and it was safe, but it was also nondescript. So I ran into books, and indeed the first one that knocked me for a loop was Huckleberry Finn. And little did I know, I had started at the top with one of the greatest books in American literature. I started dressing like Huck Finn, and I forced my friends to dress like Tom Sawyer. This only meant straw hats and a walking stick, and cutting off our jeans at the ankles so that we looked bedraggled.
And you were how old at this point?
Maybe, what would second grade be? I was like 7 or 8. Say 7. And from then on, half of my, maybe even more of my mental life was spent in novels, mostly novels, kids' books, but also adult books, nonfiction. It was the centennial of the Civil War, and my dad was from North Carolina, and American Heritage magazine came every month, taught us about the Civil War. Imagine that it was only 100 years ago then. And my dad being from North Carolina, I sided with the South in all of the little maps and the games and the whole notion of the underdog and the lost cause, etc. But I read about both sides, of course, and was an expert on the Civil War, without any emotional sense of it, of the essentially the mass death of a stupendous war that killed something like 500,000 American men. That didn't register. I was too young to have any kind of a moral sensibility. My mom came from a religious town in Illinois, Zion, Illinois, a literally religious utopia founded in 1895 by an Australian faith healer. And she was a musician, a piano teacher, and so she went to churches in Orange County looking for the best music. So we were variously Methodist or Presbyterian. We landed in Lutheran church, and I played music for her in the church. But I didn't have any, truthfully, it was right from then, it was literature that was my religion. It was the system that gave me my sense of meaning and values. All that was abstractable from the stories that I was reading, which I was reading at a tremendous clip. The library allowed me to take home 10 books a week, and I would always max out. But I didn't read 10 books a week. I probably read about 5, which is a good clip.
Indeed.
And then I would return them all and get 10 more at the library. And there were 3 local libraries, and my mom patiently drove me to these libraries once a week. She kept it to that. And when I got my driver's license at age 16, she was so happy because I could go off and drive on my own. So that was my literary childhood. Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, I'm sure there's a lot to unpack between that moment of getting the driver's license and then the kind of topics that you have addressed in your own work. And feel free to unpack that as you wish or not. But I'd like to move to, when folks ask me who don't know your work, and they'll ask me, okay, so how would you describe what Kim Stanley Robinson is doing? I'll often say something like, well, he's deeply realistic, and he's saying we're kind of screwed because we haven't taken seriously the great threats we face. And yet somehow he's also hopeful, but not naively so, but seems to have some sort of deep sense of hope that humanity will somehow find a way forward, even in the midst of all the ways that we've been so stupid. And so I guess I would love to hear you say, do you feel like that's a fair assessment of at least one of the facets of how you're trying to go about the work you're doing?
Well, yes. In fact, thank you. It's a very generous assessment. And I feel that it's accurate. I do try to write science fiction of a particular kind of describing things that could happen physically and maybe even in a human or political sense, that they could happen. and they would be interesting if they did. And we are indeed in a perilous situation. We don't know how bad that is in this sense. We don't know how close we are to running the biosphere over some tipping points where the warmer it gets, the faster the warming process itself will go, because we'll unleash some methane that's frozen in the Arctic permafrost. So there's some positive feedback loops with negative consequences, and they call them tipping points. I like to describe it as a slippery slope. When you're on a slippery slope, it's a nonlinear thing when you slide, when you slip. And so you're latched on as hard as you can be. But if you do slip, then you're falling into catastrophe. So you don't want to, and if it's a slope that's getting steeper the further down you are, you want to give yourself some clearage and stay well above the zone in which you might fall to catastrophe. And because tipping points is like a teeter-totter, and you can always imagine teetering back in the other direction like teeter-totters do. So I like the slippery slope better. But you mentioned hope, and I would again want to give credit to my mom, who was an optimist by policy. In other words, it was morally important to stay hopeful for other people, to support them. And then that included, in my sense, being a science fiction writer, the people of the future too, who when they arrive deserve to have the same healthy biosphere that we were given, to the extent that we were. And so describing that project, it can be called utopian science fiction, and I'm happy with that. That's what I do. There's stories set in the future, and many times the future is struggling to achieve a better society and a better relationship to the biosphere and the planet than we have right now. And that would be my definition of utopia, not an end state, not a final perfect society, which is obviously impossible, but just things getting better. And truthfully, that's an enormous generator of new stories. Ordinary literature describes the relationships between individuals and their consciences, and sometimes to a certain extent their societies, but they seldom go on to describe these individuals, these characters who are crucial, their relationship to their planet, their biosphere that is their home. So science fiction allowed me that from early on. And for instance, amongst the first novels I ever wrote were three that were set right in Orange County, where I grew up. One of them was where things had gone drastically badly, a nuclear exchange with neutron bombs, so people died, but infrastructure didn't. And America in Orange County was blasted back into like Huck Finn, Hannibal, Missouri, 1840, in terms of how they lived. The second one was a dystopia. So that's called the post-apocalypse. It's not a genre I believe in very much, but I wrote one. Then the dystopia was where everything that was bad in the current moment was getting worse. That's the Gold Coast, and that most resembles my life in my own 20s in the 1970s. I wrote it in 86. And then the Pacific Edge is a utopia where things have gone better, but in a rather small-scaled way of more community, more solidarity amongst people, more economic equality and security. And it was still, I guess what you would call it now, I didn't even think of it this way then, is a social democracy, a kind of there's still a business in a capitalist sense, but there's a social security floor, and there's a ceiling on how wealthy you can get when at that point you've maxed out. And the ceiling is only 10 times more wealth than the floor, and the floor is adequate. So in other words, if you're at the floor, you're comfortable and you have security and you have work. But and the richest person in that society has 10 times that, well, 10 times adequacy is a stupendous luxury if you think about what adequacy really means. But I just want to point out that in our society now, the ratio of the poorest to the richest is more like 1,000 times. So we do live in an age of massive inequality, as you know. So this was really, your description of my project is, to my mind, right. I've gone about 200 or 300 years into the future for the most part. I've stayed within the solar system for the most part. And I have a few excursions further away in space and time, but some of my science fiction brothers and sisters, because we are like a small town, we all know each other, they are much bolder. You can cross the galaxies. They go millions of years in the future. And it's a great story space for them, but it's not how my imagination works.
Yeah. I reread Ministry for the Future in leading up to our conversation today, but my recollection of the first time I read it a couple of years ago was that I read the opening chapter and was so overwhelmed, I put it down, and I don't think I came back to it for half a year.
Oh, yeah.
And this devastating depiction of horrors that we may be facing in the future. And so I raise that to ask the question, as you look so realistically at some of these horrors that we are not only facilitating, but are going to have to perhaps navigate, how have you processed that yourself emotionally? I mean, what's that like for you to navigate that sort of weighty reality that you're grappling with?
Well, thank you for that. That's an interesting... I've had to think hard about that. I remain frightened. The Ministry for the Future starts with a heat wave where the combination of heat and humidity goes so high. And this they call the wet bulb temperature, but often in the States on weather channels, they'll call it the heat index. And so dry heat you can handle, and I've felt it myself here in Davis, up to like 115 degrees without a problem because it's dry and you sweat. But if it's humid, and if the humidity is high, like 80% or whatever, it only needs to be 90 degrees, and the combination, when you get to a temperature called wet bulb 35, will kill you in a few hours. So you can die of overheating just like you can die of freezing. And this was news to me, and really even news to the medical community, that there was an upper limit on human tolerance for humid heat. And since you're in Nashville, you all know this.
Yeah.
That, and my mom used to say this in a repetitive way, it's not the heat, it's the humidity. But what she really meant was it's the two in combination that will get you. And she, from Illinois, one of the hottest wet bulb temperatures ever recorded, like a wet bulb 34, was right outside Chicago. So the whole of the Midwest and the Southeast of the United States having high humidity when it's hot, which doesn't happen in the American Southwest, is in danger of rising global temperatures that when they spiral up into a spike, like right now you are out there in a spike of low temperatures because a polar vortex has blasted out of the Arctic down onto you. But when it spikes hot, it could be dangerous. And here's my point. If the electrical grid goes down, then nothing you can do will save you. You could be indoors in the shade, fanning yourself as hard as you can, with all your clothes off, etc. I mean, by the hand fan. And it wouldn't do. In several hours, your vital organs would overheat and you would die of hyperthermia. I portrayed that in the first chapter of Ministry for the Future, and I've got to put it in context here. My readers knew me as basically a comic writer, as you say, hopeful and utopian. So to open that book and read the first chapter is like being punched in the gut by a friend. And I have never read that chapter aloud to an audience. That would be improper. That would cross the boundaries of human propriety. But it exists in a text, and indeed there's an audiobook version of it. And I said it in India because the North Plains, the Gangetic Plains underneath the Himalayas, are particularly susceptible to this kind of high temperature with humidity, and they have a weak electrical grid, weaker back when I wrote the book, which was just 6 or 7 years ago. I wanted to make the point that we cannot just adapt to climate change. We cannot continue to burn fossil fuels and, being such clever creatures that we are, simply adapt to it and go onward and let the chips fall where they may. That won't work. Many of us will die of that. And it's not just the tropics. It goes right on up to the latitudes of Chicago. Well, that was, at the point I wrote it, 2019, there were adaptationists saying, don't worry so much about climate change, we'll just adapt because we are so smart. And I wanted to make the point that's not true. We have to cope. We have to decarbonize the atmosphere. So I started with that. The rest of the book has to stick with India. I felt that as an obligation. Having put a disaster there, I didn't want to go back over to the rest of the world and say, oh, we'll solve the problem. The Indian nation and their people are first and foremost, in solving the problem because they've been so devastated. And I started from there. And then the ministry is just a little UN office based in Zurich, because my wife and I lived in Zurich for a couple of years when we were young. And then what could organizations do to help us to come to grips with our biosphere problem? And I ran it out as a kind of thought experiment with the idea that we don't have to have a master plan. We aren't going to have any magic. We're not going to have any superheroes. It's just going to be ordinary people kludging their way through to a good future. And I wanted to describe that in a way that you could believe all the way through the book. There should be no chapter where you say, as you read it, oh, that couldn't happen. You might say, oh, that would be unlikely or that would be lucky, but not that you would ever say that couldn't happen. It could happen that we could get to a good place in about 30 years. So that's the story of that novel.
What? So let me push you a little bit more on the question, original question there. What has that been like for you then in grappling with those realities internally, emotionally, for yourself?
Well, as I said, I remain frightened. A mass heat death could happen if we continue. Right now, the planet is about 1.5 degrees Celsius higher than it was 200 years ago. And that's from human burning of fossil fuels into the atmosphere, which just creates a thermal blanket in the atmosphere that captures that heat. Right now, the transition to clean energy, it's happening. It's been a remarkable success, and it's a sign that we are capable of escaping this potential catastrophe by our own actions. Very positive signs in clean energy and the energy transition. But it's only going at a speed that has to be described as not quite fast enough. And the projections right now is that even if we continue to do the good things we're doing, we're going to have raised the temperature of the Earth by like 2.4. This is another science fiction story. How much hotter will it get? We don't know, because we don't know what we're going to do in the next 20 years. So I'm apprehensive, and the young people talk about climate dread, but that dread, which I think is a proper emotion, needs to lead to resolve, to act, rather than to doomism, as they call it, to despair. There's many a person, especially in America, the richest country on earth, who will proclaim that it's already game over, that we're cooked, we're doomed, etc. Well, that you have to push back against. It's clear when you walk outdoors on an ordinary day that it isn't quite true. We're not doomed because we can change what we do. And right now, new clean energy is cheaper than building new fossil fuel energy production. Well, this is crucial. You no longer have to be saintly. You no longer have to pay what they called the green premium. In other words, pay extra in order to avoid carbon dioxide emissions. It's cheaper to put in a solar panel than it is to put in a new oil well. And that means that we could squeak out of this alive. So I tremble between hope and fear, just like everybody else in their own personal life. This whole division between hope and fear is super basic to our emotional set. And in literature, it translates to dystopia, expression of our fears, and utopia, the expression of our hopes. And I would say also, I'll add to this, the Ministry for the Future has upended my life, which when it came out in 2020, I was a well-regarded and successful science fiction writer. Well, that's somewhat of a niche position in our culture, science fiction being what it is, popular in the movies, but in literature, somewhat of a not a club, but a smaller community of readers that like to read it. And that community is very well connected. I was well known in that community after 40 years of appearing in it with books and going to some of the conventions that they hold. But then Ministry came out and boom, a lot of people, it's the first book of mine they ever read, or it's even the first science fiction book they've ever read, and they didn't even recognize what it was as science fiction because it starts now and heads 30 years off into the future. And it made a splash. I can say that without any fear of overstating it. It made a splash, and I don't even want to list the waves of the splash. It would go on too long and sound ostentatious. But it certainly upended my life to where I've doing events like this one right here, but others in person, which is much more onerous. And ironically, it causes me to have a much higher carbon burn the more I travel. I try to restrict it, but some of them are important. So I haven't had time to write a new novel, and I've had to learn what is it to be a public intellectual, a speaker about climate change as if I'm an expert, which I'm not, but I am a storyteller, and the story needs to be told.
Another way that I've described your work is that, and I think I was especially said this after reading Ministry for the Future the first time, was that I felt like I got to sit in a number of college classes on economic theory or political science, political theory. But it seems to me that you often introduce us to either ignored or widely unknown historical and human tendencies. They could be economic, psychological, scientific, as a way of enkindling a new imagination for things that might be possible. And again, is that something that's close to your consciousness about what you're doing in writing science fiction?
Well, it certainly was in Ministry for the Future. Yes, this was almost a blueprint. Here, let's do these things, we'll be better off. And that's why the book is filled with mini essays. They aren't exactly essays. Usually they're somebody ranting or eyewitness accounts, things that people saw, but also little descriptive passages like a Wikipedia with an attitude.
Yeah.
There's a fair bit of that in there because I wanted to lay all my cards on the table and say, this is how this book is working on you. Let's think about that also. So there's a little chapter on ideology and a little chapter on group formation and the nature of history. There's a bunch of riddles in it, and a lot of different subgenres or forms. It's a formal experiment, and in that I mix a lot of smaller forms together and whip them up into one novel. And this is what I love about the novels, is the novel it just means new. It doesn't have a necessary genre. And the standard novel now, which is like 20 chapters of dramatized scenes, it wasn't always that way. There was a lot more summary, there was a lot more narrator, commentary. And I made use of the whole history of the novel, and even with the riddles, going back to Anglo-Saxon, these older forms, or the it narrative, where the speaking thing, the speaking narrator is a violin or a coin, in my case, a carbon atom or a photon. These all come out of the 18th century. So I ransacked the whole bag of tricks, truthfully, to make a kind of a mess, a grab bag, deliberately, so that you could see us coping with climate change and getting right with the biosphere is not going to be a simple or planned process, but it's going to be the result of us flailing to try to do good things. And that's why I wrote the novel the way I did.
It has been so delightful to see more and more listeners like you sign up for NSC Plus. Our growing community is made up of intelligent and thoughtful people looking for a holistic approach to human flourishing. Signing up for NSC Plus is also a way to support the show and the work we're doing, and in fact, we depend upon that kind of support. But in addition to supporting the show, you'll get exclusive access to bonus content, and the No Small Endeavor you've come to love will be completely ad-free. In fact, you won't even hear ads like this one. So go to nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSC Plus to become a member of our community today. Join for as little as $5 a month. Again, go to nosmallendeavor.com, click on that red button that says Join NSC Plus to become a member today. You mentioned there a moment ago ideology as one of the small chapters there in the book, and that's one I had noted. You say ideology, an imaginary relationship to a real situation. We all have an ideology, and this is a good thing. Some kind of personal organizing system is necessary to make sense of things in ways that allow one to decide and to act. So I'm wondering what would be some key elements of your own ideology that you might not have mentioned yet?
Well, how can I put it? I'm an American leftist, and I want to keep that as vague and broad as possible because basically I'm a novelist trying to write good novels, but that's my politics. So I'm always for public over private. I'm always for the commons over property. I'm always for government over business. I'm just putting it in the simplest, commonly used American terms. My wife was a federal scientist. I'm always for science over other systems of inquiry. And I retain from my mom, who was a crucial figure in my life, as was my dad, but from my mom, this sense that you have to have a sense of the larger community and of the sacred. You should have a devotional attitude towards reality. And rather than just function in it as trying to get more of everything, to try to have a project. And this is the ideology called existentialism, that you have to make up the meaning that you believe in, and then you have to turn it into action by way of a project, which is a life project. I'm going to try to do this or that. And that gives your life meaning, and then you can function within that with pursuit of happiness, you might say. And so working on those bases in the most vague terms, I guess would be my ideology. It's hard sometimes to translate those into practical actions or into current political systems. I think if I would be more comfortable in Europe with its multitude of small parties making accommodations and alliances with each other, so that you could be much more particular in which political party you were going to cast your votes for. But in terms of a general plan of action, I mean, I come out of a Lutheran tradition, Protestant, but very formally like the Catholicism that had just moved away from. The gatherings are important, the rituals are important. There's a long chapter near the end of Ministry for the Future where they are attempting to create a kind of a planetary religion, which is really the oldest one, a kind of shamanism or first religion that left Africa with humans when 120,000 years ago, when modern humans as physical specimens began to leave Africa and occupy the rest of the world. That religion went with them. I think that it's 100,000 years old at least. And what we call shamans now, well, you can take the characteristics of a shaman figure, what they do, how they act, and quite a few of the Old Testament prophets were clearly shaman figures. And there's a new book claiming that both Jesus and modern hedge fund managers are using shamanic techniques of And not just the laying on of hands or the pretending to be able to cure things they can't cure, but more this, the placebo effect of encouraging people. The placebo effect really works. There's scientific experiments that have evidence that not only does the placebo work on you, but even when you know it's a placebo, it still works. Well, this is funny, and it shows what we are as creatures. And so I'm interested in this. People sometimes talk about Gaia, but let's just say Mother Earth is a kind of a home, but also could be a sort something to regard as sacred and deserving of our devotion. And so I also think of scientific study as a form of devotion, as a kind of a active prayer. Let's see how this thing works. Let's see if we can help people with how it works. Let's see if we can cure diseases and make the sick well, and also just make everybody also more comfortable. So this is this project and my ideology. That's my best attempt to briefly to describe.
Obviously, given that ideology and in reading your books, especially Ministry for the Future, power, capital, economic justice are matters that are always close to the surface and sometimes explicitly discussed at some length. And you also, in that regard, point to the small number of people with extensively disproportionate power. But unpack a little bit for us how you think about that and how you frame that.
Well, power is different than wealth, and the two are sometimes conflated. But you can be quite powerful if a lot of people do what you say without being particularly wealthy. But if you're immensely wealthy, you can also buy a certain amount of power. It's like the Beatles said, you can't buy love, you can't buy health, although you can certainly get better health by spending a lot of money on medical care. But you can buy some power by influence. You can buy the votes of politicians by funding their campaigns. So yes, the wealthiest 1% in this country and in the world own about 50% of the wealth. And this is unsustainable and bad. And the poorest 50% of people on this planet own something like 5% of the wealth. They are just flat broke. And they have nothing but their labor power to sell. And if they can't sell that, then in some countries they're supported minimally by the society. And in other countries like ours, they're just left to die. When you go homeless in America, your average lifetime is 5 years. And in that entire time, in those 5 years, you're struggling to live, to exist. Most of them are not suicidal, and nor have they given up. But without a home, the elements are too harsh and your health begins to descend. My wife helps to, and it's an Episcopal church in Davis where she helps with a communal free meal. And even in Davis, which is a prosperous little college town here in California, there's about 250 homeless people who are in the process of slowly dying despite their struggles against it. And I helped my wife in the kitchen. It's not really my nature. Seeing all this makes me too angry. But I've helped her out just as a solidarity with my wife's project and able to help out in the kitchen. I used to go get the flowers that the florist shop was going to throw out, and then I arranged them in vases so that the homeless dinner had some flowers in vases. This was not my idea, but I was the one who executed it and became quite a high-speed flower arranger. I had about 10 minutes to do 15 vases as best I could. And also sweeping the floors and washing the dishes. Handing out food to other people, I find horrid, because neither person likes it. Charities, I reject it. There should be, the society ought to make it as a matter of dignity that everybody has an adequacy as part of being part of the society and given or required to do work, of course. But to charity itself, the giver feels pretentious and overbearing and holier than thou, and the person getting it feels degraded and having to beg. It doesn't work, but people are too hungry to say no. So I even forget how I started on that, but you can reel me back in.
Yeah. I want to, you've mentioned a couple of times your childhood and your mother's Lutheranism. What would you say for you, in what ways has that childhood formative influence, to what degree have you carried some of that with you, and in what ways? And in what ways have you rejected that and found other sources of inspiration or direction or guidance for yourself?
Well, I would say that it's in me deep. And what that means, though, since I'm a secular person, and I think that the universe is obviously miraculous, but whether there is a maker of it, I don't know, and wouldn't care to make a claim in that regard. So I'm willing to say, what does that mean? A kind of humanism, a kind of secular. I believe in science. One day, Jehovah's Witnesses came to our door and knocked on the door and explained themselves. And one of them, my wife had answered, and I was listening to her. And they said, well, what do you believe in? And she said, she had to think. Well, I believe in the double-blind study. They did not know what to make of that, but I remembered it forever because my wife is indeed a scientist and was brought up Unitarian, which she says is a kind of a nothing burger of a religion. I don't quite agree because the New England Transcendentalists were very important to American literature, and I'm an English major. English and American literature are the only thing I really know. But in any case, for me, I just think I use my mom as an example of a moral character. And so she was a piano teacher, and she did charitable work. She went to church every Sunday, and then she lived a good life. My dad went along with it because he loved her. He himself was very quiet about all this. And she was not a proselytizer. She just lived by example and tried to do things. And so I shift the registers into something that is more like, okay, I'll grant this, the biosphere is sacred. Life is strange in that it seems to be anti-entropic and semi-miraculous. We don't know how life began. We don't know how it manages. We do know a lot about how it operates now, but we don't know how it began in this universe. We don't know how the universe began, but we know it happened 13.82 billion years ago, and I laugh hard at that 0.2 because the astronomers, they got to be kidding me because it's a little bit indirect, their reasoning here. But they have their reasons. They would point to the data and the evidence and the methodology by which they came to this number. So what does it mean? Here we are. I don't have a good explanation, but I would just say that the tradition from my mom, which is not, it was the Christian Catholic Church of Zion, Illinois. It was that specific. The founder of it was let's say an oddball, a faith healer, Dr. Alexander Dowie. He came from Australia. He traveled the world. He's mentioned briefly in Joyce's novel Ulysses because on the day that Ulysses happened in 1904, Dowie was going to give a lecture, and the broadsides advertising it were all over the streets. So Dowie was not famous, but he wasn't obscure in his time, and he got this little town north of Chicago started, Zion, Illinois, right on the Wisconsin border. There's still a feeling that I have that you should have a purpose and that you should try to be helping other people as best you can. So, but literature's my game. So then when I tell a story, when I write my novels, I want people to end those novels feeling better than when they began them. Well, that's a kind of calling. And when I titled The Ministry for the Future, that was specifically using ministry in its 2 or 3 different meanings, including the religious sense of an office or a calling. And yet it's also a diplomatic or bureaucratic place. So it's a very useful word. And the title of the book is part of its success. People immediately are intrigued. They're thinking, well, what would that mean? If you advocate for people who aren't even born yet and are generations or centuries away, what do we do in the present to help them out? And how do we give them voice in our decisions that we make now? That's a topic that is somewhat to my surprise. It's really on the table these days.
What comes to mind when I ask you what have been some of those sacred moments that you've experienced? Some sort of transcendental moment.
Well, several of them have been in the Sierra Nevada of California, where I've made about 150 backpacking trips through my life, and I love the place. And it's wilderness in the sense that it's national parks. It's protected by humans, and humans are just to be visitors in these spaces. And the mountains are gorgeous. And some of them have to do with seen animals, sometimes rare animals, like the Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep, which was listed under the Endangered Species Act as in danger of going extinct, and was therefore given federal help and went from 100 individuals up to 600, and then the snows of 4 years ago killed about half of those. They're still in danger, but they might survive, and that's a human effort to bring them back. To see one, I never expected to happen. And then suddenly I was looking at about 10% of the whole species, a herd in a meadow, about 30 of them, mothers and fathers and children. And the kids were gamboling around in this meadow. They were goofball fun. And I realized that life, and especially the mammals, all mammals are cousins to us, very closely related genetically, but also spiritually. The Muir called them our horizontal brothers and sisters. That's been important. I was there when my wife gave birth to our two sons, helping out as best I could. Those were transcendent moments. I guess life slapping you in the face where you actually see it. So the distinction here is you can see, like in the Himalayas, you can see rock and ice, or in Antarctica, where indeed I've spent some time. Rock and ice and sky, it is mind-boggling. It has an aura of majesty or sublimity that is very powerful. So standing on the polar plateau in Antarctica with nothing in sight except for me, because the vehicle had driven off over the horizon. So it was me. It was a sheet of ice that was 10,000 feet high, totally horizontal, no clouds in the sky. And so it was being put into some kind of geometrical object, a flat white plane, a blue dome above me, and me. So what was that? That was me in the cosmos, but it was also not alive. That was strange. That was a different kind of transcendence. The more normal kind, I think, is to see life in action, like a weird salamander in a stream in an old-growth forest, and everything looks really ancient. And I know that eastern Tennessee has some of the biggest stands of old-growth forest that was never cut down in the entire nation, maybe in the world even. So these moments where you see a complete biome that was living like it was before we entered it, maybe in the terms of the Bible, this is some kind of Eden moment or pre-Eden, before people arrived, and you get a glimpse of it. Those are the kind of things that that hit me.
Yeah. Another thread that I see often occurring in your work is various commitments to or celebration of what to call it, epistemic intellectual humility. How would you suggest we cultivate that?
Well, if you think of epistemology as how do we know what we know, well, we learn it from other humans. We're taught it but then we also have our basic perceptions and cognition. It's often linguistic. So again, we're taught it. We're like bees in a hive. A bee is an incredibly competent and powerful individual, but they need the hive. Communal creatures, or another way to put it, given that we're mammals, is that we're herd animals. And although quite amazing as individuals, we're also members of a herd. So the humility is there's so much that we don't know, and also the why of things. So you can study the universe right back to the Big Bang up till now, in incredible detail, down to the atomic level and even the subatomic level. You can know an awful lot about how things are working, but right at the edges of our knowledge, there's a very deep mysteries. Dark matter, why gravity and quantum mechanics don't mesh up. The mysteries are, in a certain sense, the more we know, the deeper the mysteries at the edges get. And also, why is it all here at all? So very quickly, you can walk right to the edge of looking out at a big ocean of unknowing from the shore of your knowing. And this, I think, leads to various kinds of senses of the miraculous, of the mystical. Oh, it's all a mystery. I mean, that is not a trivial thing to be a mystic, to acknowledge the mystery that our knowing sits inside of, and say, the mystery is important too. It's maybe in the mountains, it's easy to feel, or looking at the night sky, it's easy to feel really small.
Do you you point to, I would guess, both in the Mars trilogy, oftentimes, as well as certainly in Ministry for the Future, and numerous other books of yours I've read, you don't give us heroes the way a lot of fiction gives us heroes, but you give us like bureaucrats and scientists. What's your thinking there?
Well, in the Mars trilogy, in Green Mars, I have one chapter called The Scientist as Hero. And that was on purpose, that naming act. And yet, science is a team sport. It exists as individuals agreeing to work together and check each other's work, and then work through institutions where they all link arms at the elbows and say, we say this together. And this, what's a fact? Well, it's something that has been so investigated that scientists and other people agree we don't need to look into this any further. The sun's going to come up at a certain time of day. The solar system is what it is. The facts become the facts as a general agreement. They're revealed, you might say, by inquiry. So I just pursue that line of thought that we can, as a collective, not so the individuals, there have been remarkable individuals who, through their intelligence and courage and persistence, managed to change their whole communities and sometimes even the world. So there are heroes, but also this is something out of Philip K. Dick, my California science fiction wild man, a generation before me. There's sometimes that ordinary people are put at a crux moment. This is perfect for novels with plots, where their decision has ramifications, and they have to do the right thing for history to go in a good direction. So, and this is petty bureaucrats and what my wife would prefer to call technocrats, because there's some technical expertise being deployed for the good of the community. The technocrat has to do the right thing when push comes to shove, and then history goes in a better direction. That's as important as the kings or generals, or inventors, or great religious leaders. The whole hive has to be humming. And even if there happens to be a queen bee that is prominent, we're not as biologically determined as bees. We're all the same. So I'm always thinking in terms of the communal achievement, and how can that be promoted by solidarity, by the sense that, look, we do rely on each other. The people that you don't know made your food, build your house, take away your accumulations of trash, which is a miracle that we overlook quite a lot. They're all crucial to us having the ordinary lives that we have, and particularly putting food on the table, which has come from all over the world and been shipped to your grocery stores. Well, that's a fragile system. It's best to be in an agricultural place like California, like Tennessee, and in fact, a lot of the surface of the earth is given over to agriculture, and that needs to be remembered. And the shorter the supply lines are, the safer you are if there's some kind of crisis. One of the things I worry about is simply a food scare, wrecking the supply lines by people hoarding, and then suddenly there isn't enough, and suddenly there's more hoarding. A sheer panic could wreck modern civilization, because 8 billion people living on this planet is a technological achievement that includes trust and cooperation for it to work. And it's a little bit fragile, so we have to be careful.
When you think about critics, your critics, what would you say, briefly perhaps, would be the kinds of criticisms of your work that you find kind of laughable and not worth entertaining? And then on the other hand, what would be the kind of criticisms of your work that maybe kind of metaphorically sit on your shoulder because you know maybe that there's something to that you want to keep paying attention to?
Well, it's as easy as pie to tell the two apart. For me, maybe because I've been reading criticism of my work for 40 years now. And here's what you can tell with X-ray eyes. Are they on your side? Are they constructive criticism and they're trying to help you, and they are interested enough and entertained enough that they think you could do better? Or are they out to get you and making a case against you in a prosecutor's sense? Once I recognize that I'm being prosecuted by someone who's not a generous reader, then I just don't go on. It's not going to help me. It'll just make me mad. If I see that this is somebody who is actually in good faith with the work and has some things to say that will help me. An early review of Red Mars said, "Oh, this is a fine novel. It's too bad that Robinson doesn't know more about economics. It would have helped him." And I got huffy at that. I know lots about economics, which was ridiculously wrong because I was an English major. And I have spent 30 years reading political economy, trying to get better on that level. And that comment was one of the spurs in my butt to make me realize there's always more to learn. And if you're doing future societies, then the political economy of that society is front and central as to how it will work. Well, maybe it's definitely a big part of it. So I needed to know more, and I would refer that critic and my readers in general, well, try out New York 2140 or Ministry for the Future. And so 30 years after Red Mars, I've sort of sharpened my toolkit in that regard. So I don't write criticism. I think that's not, novelists who write reviews for the newspapers or for online media, they're making a mistake. I've never done it. I do write appreciations of the writers that I've loved and have read a lot of. But criticism has its place. It just needs to be in a spirit of generosity.
Do you think much about the kind of person you are trying to be?
Well, it's like, for instance, like right now, we're on a Zoom, so I could actually look at myself as I'm talking, but it's limiting. It makes you self-conscious. It throws you off your game. It's better to look elsewhere. It's better just to do things. And the best part, I think, about contemplation of yourself is, what am I doing that's helpful? What am I doing that's causing me to be stressed? And is this line of thought just me indulging myself in a kind of a fit of righteous indignation? And I want to say that righteous indignation, which is corrosive and useless emotion to have. That it's too easy. It's too pointless. I've seen a fair lot of it, and I try to avoid it. And yet there are things to be indignant about, and one wants to be righteous. So why is the combination so off-putting and useless? Well, we can all think about that one. And we all suffer from it. So here's what I'm going to say. A novelist is a person trying to get out of the way and tell other people's stories. It's not being a lyric poet. It's not self-expression. It's like a telephone operator in a 1940s movie. The woman typically is pulling out cords and sticking in plugs, and she's connecting things up, and then people tell their stories. So I think that my chosen line of work, writing novels, is a reflection of my natural, I'm easy to be convinced of things, so they call it lability. I'm a labile mind. People talk me into things all the time, and my characters talk me into things.
Huh.
I believe them for a while, and then I walk away and I think to myself, but wait, that can't be right. But while I'm being convinced, I'm very convincible. So I have this quality in myself that I've recognized that is an asset to being a novelist. And my characters have arguments. I myself often don't take a side. What I want is a good, clear argument, and I don't know what I think. Should we terraform Mars or not? Well, I don't know, but my characters have very strong opinions about it. And that gives me a story.
You're right. Yeah, I was especially taken by, in Ministry for the Future, this sort of argument that kind of runs throughout about violence and the employment of violence, whether it's sabotage or whether it's targeted assassination. And it seems like you have these characters that they're arguing about that throughout the whole book, and you know where some of them have come down on that, but it's not obvious where you have come down on that.
Well, I should hope not, but I can say this: I am a pacifist, and I would go with the Swedish philosopher Andreas Malm, who wrote a book called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which was not a technical manual, but a philosophical tract. And here's what I can say in a nutshell: never hurt people, never damage people. There's no cause important enough to hurt another human being. But you break a pipeline or you pour sugar into a bulldozer's tank and save a forest. Wrecking things is illegal, but perhaps there's a moral cause that is a higher purpose. And so I would say, if you need to, if the biosphere is being wrecked for future generations and you need to break some machinery in order to stop it, fine, just don't get arrested, but never hurt another person physically. Now, obviously, there are characters in Ministry for the Future who don't believe that, who believe that if you were to, I don't know, kill 500 oil executives, that would solve the problem. This is not true. There's just replacement. And that poor health executive, United Health, who got shot by some young person who thought that was going to do some good, that person had a family and kids and all that. At least I assume. I don't even know the details of these things. I shudder. And when people email me and say, oh, Ministry for the Future is coming true, I'm appalled. I was just trying to describe a future that felt realistic. There's going to be violence. And indeed, when Ministry came out, people were shocked by the political violence in it. And then Russia invaded Ukraine. And then there were the murders in Israel that resulted in Israel destroying Gaza. This world is so much more violent than what I was writing about in 2019 that that strand of the novel is no longer causing eyebrows to raise at all.
You have another one of the many essays in Ministry for the Future, one that concludes, I am history, now make me good, which I found a compelling charge. And then at the end of the story, you have this beautiful carnival celebration of the beauty of the world and celebration of community, music, and that made me think in terms of this passage out of one of the Hebrew prophets, Isaiah 25, that has this sort of climactic moment of a huge party and all things, having come to some sort of justice and some sort of resolution in that moment in which they found themselves. Or it made me think of Tolkien's, the conclusion of Tolkien's trilogy, where he has this magnificent feast and this grand party. And I find those just such compelling visions. But I don't know, kind of as we close, how do you think about this charge, I am history, make me good? What's that mean to you? What's that look like for you? And how would you challenge us, encourage us to participate in such?
Yeah, well, thank you for this, Lee. It's been a pleasure throughout to talk about the whole, all these subjects from this angle, thinking so much of my mom and the tradition I come out of. So it's just a matter of putting your shoulder to the wheel. Any good work, paid or unpaid, will help. And, we're only 1/8 billionth of history, because I think history is a human creation. It's our story is history. 1/8 billionth sounds small in some regards, but my wife is a toxicologist in her beginnings, and so 1 part per billion can sometimes kill you or save you in a medicine. You can only do what you can do, but what you do, often it's maybe another analogy is particle wave. You're a particle, but you're also part of a wave, and that wave is our moment in history. You just put your shoulder to the wheel where it seems right. And that can be any work, where you're essentially, that work is being done for other people rather than for yourself, although it does keep you alive and gives you a project. So I guess what that injunction, which is from history itself or from some spirit, it's an offstage, these riddles, who's asking them? What's the right answer? I don't know. That's why riddles are so lovely. It's what that might be called a koan in Japanese Zen. It's a question without an answer that you have to ponder. How do you make history good, especially when you've got to live day to day and you've got to keep a roof over your head? You've got to make a living. Can that making a living for you and your family also add something good to society at large? Well, yes, it almost always has that function. There's very little selfish work. The two are, that's almost an oxymoron. So I don't think it's that hard. Just keeping the vision, sort of, not just eyes on the prize, because it's not really a prize, it's more of a process. As things go on, less poverty, less bloodshed, more a feeling that everybody on the planet is exactly equal to everybody else and that we're all brothers and sisters. This kind of planetary consciousness of all humans alive today, none of the individualizing details about us or our past or our language, ethnicity, all the rest of it, none of that overrides the sense that we're all one species on one planet. We have to get along. We have to take care of the planet. This is a religious position. So history is often thought of as secular, but it often is thought of as having a direction towards more good. And that's not hard to figure out ways to do.
Stan, thank you so much. It's been a delight to talk with you today. I'm grateful for your work, grateful for the time with you.
Thank you, Lee. This is a special conversation for me, as I hope you could tell.
Thanks.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.